Right. Last 2 weeks we've talked about politics, and then last week we did economics. Those videos, I did record those ones as well. They should be on the stream, so you should be able to access them in the subject support group. Because we're doing loads of these videos now, what we're starting to do is collate them all and put them into a private YouTube channel. So so they'll all basically all just be in one place. So once we're kind of up and running with that and we're happy with it, we'll share the YouTube channel so you can go and access these easier, because I think it's a bit difficult to access them in Microsoft Stream. Okay, right. So let's just think about how we revise the welfare state. I've put on this chart the key aspects of the welfare state, the key bits of legislation. When we talked about politics, when we talked about, and particularly when we talked about economics, there aren't really that many pieces of legislation or that many kind of core dates, particularly if you remember last week, if you were here when we talked about economics. It's about periods of time in the 20th century to help explain economics. When we come on to welfare state, this is when we're starting to see lots of different bits of legislation. And we need to think about how we can digest this information and revise it. How can we understand it, and how can we put it into our long-term memory? So we're not going to do this right now, but it's something that you could think about, print off, keep it in your folder, ready for when you want to come back to it, so you can revise it. Thinking to welfare, the welfare state is really about 4 different core aspects. The easy ones are health, education. Housing does sit in welfare, but it's a slightly strange one because it kind of sits into other aspects, the other 3 themes as well, particularly changing quality of life. The one that students find the most difficult to get to grips with is social welfare provision. Can anyone remember well, in fact, I've put it there. It's helping the most vulnerable in society. That's what social welfare provision is. So if we look at the ones on here that refer to social welfare provision, we've got means test comes into that. National Assistance Act, 1948, Family Allowance Act, 1945. I think that's probably most of them. Perhaps the unemployment insurance, that would come into that, national insurance. All of those come under this idea of helping the most vulnerable in society. So we can colour code them. What we also can do is make sure we're happy with what each of these pieces of legislation, what the key aspects of it, 2 or 3 important aspects of them. So if you print it off, you can annotate around the outside. But I have just highlighted, and we're just going to briefly talk about 3 here. The ones in bold, I have put them in bold because I would put these as absolutely essential landmark pieces of legislation. Landmark, they completely transform the environment, the kind of context of welfare. So let's just talk about the Butler Education Act. Does someone want to unmute? Letitia, I haven't spoken to you this morning. You weren't in the lesson. Can you unmute?
Yeah, I can, but my voice is a bit weird. So if I go off, yeah.
It sounds perfectly good to me at the moment. Just tell me, why do you think I might have highlighted the Butler Education Act as a landmark piece of legislation?
Because it was kind of like the first major change in education for a while.
Okay, yeah, definitely. If we went back, the other 2 big education ones would be Fisher Education Act, and also the Haddo Report 1926. Haddo Report, if you recall, tried to set up this tripartite system of education. Tripartite meaning you've got the technical, the secondary education, and elementary education, but or academic education, but it doesn't. The recommendations aren't followed through in 1926, primarily because of they don't have the funding for it. Could also say, you know, it's the report is happening in a Conservative government, and the will isn't there necessarily to amend education. And also, I think when we talked about education, as well as there being a Conservative government, there wasn't really the demand for changes to education because we still had a traditional economy. You know, working class tended to go into manufacturing, industrial sectors. They perhaps didn't necessarily need a highly academic education. But it changes with the Butler Education Act. Why is there the impetus? Why is there the motivation to change education by 1944? Anyone?
Was it that they wanted to have a knowledgeable workforce going ahead after the war?
Thank you, Sam. Absolutely. You could say that the economic context is changing, and the Second World War really highlighted some of the weaknesses in education. You've got these men being conscripted into the army with really quite limited education, and they had to give them education kind of on the job when they were fighting. And also, you know, there are other aspects. You know, the war is such a game changer for welfare. It exposed levels of poverty because we got evacuation. And also this kind of sense that the world has got to be better, that if people have made this sacrifice in the Second World War, that from the end of the Second War, there has got to be a payoff for that sacrifice, and that means improving education for all. Also, the Second World War is a game changer for education because we get massive centralisation in lots of different areas. The health service is the absolute classic example of that. Whereas before, health had been piecemeal, in bits, it wasn't coordinated, it wasn't centralised. The Second World War really changes that. And people accept high levels of government intervention in their everyday lives, in welfare, and there's this kind of expectation that they're going to do that. So that's another reason why perhaps from 1944 we get the Butler Education Act. Also, not forgetting, what's that really big report that's published in the Second World War?
Haddo, is it?
Bev.
Oh, I heard two. The Haddo's 26, and I heard Bev, when I assumed that was going to go on to the Beveridge report, tackling the five giants, and one of those was ignorance. So it's clearly on the political agenda. Butler Education Act makes education compulsory for all. I think it's up to the age of 15. So that in itself is going to make it a landmark piece of legislation, and it sets the system that's going to kind of remain in place with the tripartite system. Although it is changed, this is the dominant theme of education until we get to comprehensivization in the 1960s. So we've kind of talked about the NHS. It's landmark because it's highly centralized. It's bringing together all of the kind of changes that have happened, although they have been minimal, in the health service. What have we got? Perhaps, well, we've only really got the Emergency Medical Services Act of 1939. That's the one that kind of brings the hospitals, it centralises hospitals in a response to the war effort. And NHS landmark because it established this principle of free at the point of delivery as well, and that has remained in place ever since. The only other one that I highlighted, in bold is the means test. I think you really need to make sure that you've kind of got to grips with the means test. Can someone just suggest why I might have highlighted that one?
Because it was widely unpopular.
Yeah, so you could say it is absolutely why. Why was it? I think that's Letitia. Why was it so unpopular, the means test?
Because you had people going in and actually like raiding houses to see what they had cat and things in their cupboards, and it wasn't very fair.
Yes. I think it's just it's such a landmark because it really sums up as well the 1930s. It's done in response to that rising unemployment. It's up to 3 million in the 1930s. It's a good indication of the government failing to really get to grips with the economic problems that really have been there throughout the 1920s. I think that's perhaps why I've kind of highlighted that. It just links into so many other areas of what's going on in the 1930s, the means test. And also, I suppose you could also say it's a really key influence in terms of what happens after the Second World War. So we look at things like the National Assistance Act, the National Insurance Act 1946. When they established these pieces of social welfare, it was always in the back of their minds that they didn't want to go back to the means test, the hated means test, and how people had suffered in 1931. So again, I think that probably means that it deserves to be called a landmark piece of legislation. Does anyone want to suggest any others they think perhaps would warrant being called landmark, that stand out to you? Okay, I'm going to rephrase that. I'm going to say you've got to pick one other that you would classify as landmark. You can put it in the chat if you want to. What would you pick if you had to pick one more? Right, Lily has gone for the Family Allowance Act. Lily, do you want to either unmute or put on the chat why you would plump for that one?
Payment was given, it was like a child benefit given to the mother, so it sort of gave them a bit more independence. Good,
yeah, that would be a good argument. Sydney's gone for the Emergency Medical Service of 1939. Sydney, why would you go with that one?
It was kind of the beginning of centralisation, and it kind of set the path for other legislation to do with that. And
right, good, yeah, I agree with that. That's a really good argument. Jack's also agreed with you. He said, yeah, the Emergency Medical Service Act. I mean, you could say if we think back to when we looked at health, there were so many barriers to improving the health and creating a system. There wasn't the political will. You had resistance from insurance companies as well. It was a phenomenally complicated system. So you perhaps needed that break. You needed the war to be able to bring together all those different elements of the medical services. Holly's gone for the New Towns Act of 1946. Holly, give me an argument why you could go with that one, please.
The building of like 1 million houses because of the act was probably like really substantial. Like it was short term, but they'd just come back from a war and they managed to build so many houses.
Yeah, and I think if we kind of put that in the wider context of the 20th century as well, if we think back to 1918, they'd made this promise to build this land fit for heroes and failed. Sorry about that. So they failed to make this land fit for heroes, but you could say that they were kind of completing that promise that they made with the New Towns Out of 1946. The only thing I'd say about that possibly is it didn't completely address the shortage of housing issue, because that's something that keeps going on into the 60s and into the 70s as well. I think possibly you could also pick the Wheatley Housing Act of 1924, because it's really the first evidence of social housing being provided by the government. Of course, it's the only radical thing really that the Labour government did in their 9-month ministry in 1924. So again, it's shifting responsibility from or greater responsibility onto the state to provide welfare and in this case housing. Okay, all good arguments. Let's click on. So the only other thing, I think, to revise welfare and recap on welfare, yes, you need to know kind of the key bits of legislation that we've just talked about, but to really understand it, you need to be able to understand what's either driving welfare or what is restricting welfare. So there's two things you can do with this. Firstly, you can just colour code. So if we took, for example, the dominance of the Conservatives, do you think that is something that is encouraging welfare or restricting? You can put it in the chat if you want to. So when we have government dominated by the Conservatives, is that likely to promote more welfare or restrict it? Right, Yasmin has gone with restricting, so is Letitia, yes, and Sydney has as well. And Jack's given me a reason as well, which is what we were going to come on to, and Hannah's right. So you're quite right. If we think about what the Conservatives actually stand for, it tends to be small government. Whereas underneath, we've got the growth of the Labour Party. Their core support is the working class, who are the ones that are particularly going to benefit possibly from welfare. They see a far greater role for the state in people's lives, in society, whereas the Conservatives don't. So we can colour code these factors underneath, but also we can place them on our timeline. So we think about Conservative dominance. That's a really strong theme running really from 1922. You could argue, well into the Second World War, because they were the dominant party in the national government. With the growth of the Labour Party, though, don't forget about the effect of the Labour Party on the Conservatives. So the Conservatives are kind of looking over their shoulder at the growth of the Labour Party, thinking, maybe we need to do something, which is actually going to widen our support base. So you do see the Conservative Party starting to change their attitudes to welfare, perhaps not because they're so committed to welfare, but they're worried about losing votes. Laissez-faire attitudes is very much a theme of the pre-war era. So we go pre-Second World War era, so 1918 up to 1945, but it is being chipped away at. It's really dominant in the 19th century, but it's being undone partly by the Liberal governments before the First World War, because they had a kind of change of attitude. Their attitude was they wanted people to be free. So initially they didn't have lots of welfare policies because they felt that it restricted people being free. But their change of attitude was, well, people can't be free if they are burdened by poverty. So the Liberal Party starts to change its attitudes that if you're going to make people free, you're going to have to address issues of welfare. So laissez-faire is becoming less of a dominant attitude in the first half of the 20th century. I've put on there impact of individuals. Do you think that restricts or inhibits welfare, do you think? Letitia has gone with helps it. Letitia, can you unmute and tell me why?
I think like the reports that individuals made, like the evidence to implant the welfare might not be there.
When you're kind of thinking about individuals, which individuals would you pick out as being promoters of welfare?
Beveridge.
Good. Can you think of one other one?
What's his name? The Clement Attlee, maybe?
Yes.
Not him, but Bevan.
Bevan, right? Yeah, that's the one I was particularly thinking of, because he's the one that he's the absolute driving force. And Jack's put it on there. Yeah, Beveridge, Bevan. So sometimes you need someone to kind of take a grip of a problem and really go with it. But equally, I think you could say some individuals are having a restrictive impact on welfare. Think to the 1970s. Who might I be thinking of with that? Sydney's got it. Yes, Margaret Thatcher. So Thatcher, if we go to the 1970s and the rise of new right thinking, does start to challenge particularly social welfare, and that there was this kind of increasing culture of dependency. So that in itself as an idea is a restriction on welfare. Effects of war. Well, we've already talked about, the positive impact of the Second World War on welfare, and how that really galvanized attitudes to war and allowed for the government to intervene. But you could say perhaps the other effect of war, linking to economic downturn, is that there's lots of debt, isn't there? So at the end of the First World War, one of the reasons why they don't create that land fit for heroes, is they simply haven't got enough money to do it. What happens in 1948, which allows them, despite the debt, to create, well, they were referred to as a New Jerusalem, the welfare state after the Second World War. Thank you, Jack. You're absolutely right. It is the Marshall Plan. So that funding from America was absolutely key to establishing the NHS in particular. Periods of economic downturn, well, there's no money to invest in welfare. We'll come to high unemployment last. Consensus. Consensus, you could start to make some of the links between these factors as well. Consensus is a result of the effect of war. This idea that, they all bought into this idea that Beveridge was promoting. And if you've got consensus, you haven't got criticism. So we have a long period of agreement of a commitment to a welfare state. So that's going to promote welfare. High unemployment. What do we think about that? Is that going to restrict welfare or promote it? Both. And I've got a restrict from Holly. Sydney, can you unmute and tell me what you think about this one?
It promotes it because there's a need for it, but it also restricts it because there's less money in the economy, so they can't do it as well. Yeah,
good. I like that argument. Holly, what do you think?
I was probably going to say the same, more people are relying on welfare, put more of a strain on it.
Yes, and I think perhaps again you'd have to divide it between the pre-Second World War era and post, and that's linked to attitudes towards unemployment change. In the period 1918 to 1945, or certainly into the kind of 1930s, there's this idea that unemployment is cyclical, it comes and goes, it's a natural phenomenon, therefore it's not up to the state to regulate unemployment. Post Second World War, we've got a different dominant economic theory of Keynesianism, which places far more emphasis on the government to intervene and stimulate the economy to help out the unemployed, and that is going to have repercussions for welfare as well.